All right. What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp and my buddy, Aaron Simmons, philosopher extraordinaire, right here. First podcast being recorded after 3.5 weeks running around Europe with the family. So I don't know what time zone I'm in. I don't even know if I remember how to use a microphone, Aaron.
So I should tell everybody that yesterday when we were setting this up, and I was like, dude, I could do it today. And Tripp's response was, well, since I'm not quite sure what day it is, how about tomorrow? so that seemed entirely appropriate. Also, I've got to compliment you, Tripp. Your start lead-in bumper video, it's almost like that you have aged into your 40s, and it's moved away from like 90s hip-hop meets, stadium pew 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 kind of sounds, and now it's this like mystical aura setting stuff. Well, so welcome to maturity, my friend.
Sadly, it's just because I didn't have all my stuff uploaded because I hadn't turned the computer on in so long, so I had to use a pre.
So the only time that you are mature is when laziness has overridden the immaturity. Thank you.
I got to brush that off.
I'm glad that we are on the same page then going into this. As I wear my Alien Ant Farm t-shirt in death metal script. So yes, clearly we are rocking at the level people need to access at 11 a.m. on a Monday morning.
I really hope that's the font on death metal script.
That's right.
You could just start. You should just start writing love poems, but in death metal script.
Think about how different, like the Romantic poets, Shelley and Keats and all of them, had they written their stuff, but yes, in like death metal models. I think that'd have been fantastic.
Oh, yeah. Well, so what we're gonna do today is we're gonna talk about just the collective failure of the church and the state. And the reason is Aaron and I were talking about this on the podcast, and the response was so big. We're like, okay, let's get a bunch of our philosopher and religion scholar friends to all speak into this. So we emailed a bunch of them, and quite a few said, hey, I'll totally record a talk. So we're running an online summit, Democracy in Tension. And here's how that whole summit's going to work. You're going to get a whole bunch of talks around 30 minutes or so from different perspectives and also different disciplines, like, different areas within philosophy, theology, history, these kinds of things, all addressing those tensions. And when we launch it in a couple weeks, they'll all be there ready for you to watch it, whatever your summer pace is. And then you'll be able to send in questions, be it ones that are run across different themes you heard, or ones for specific contributors. And then Aaron and I are going to do follow-up interviews with a bunch of contributors where we know what are the big questions everyone that watched all these voices have. What are the questions they have for these specific thinkers? And then they'll end up being on a podcast where you will all have contributed to the kind of conversations we have. And I'm super pumped. Homebrewedclasses.com. You can donate anything. Well, you can't go below zero, and you can't go above $1 million.
So you will not pay people to come.
I won't pay them.
Good to know. No, I think what's so cool about this model, and like you said, I mean, this came out of Tripp and I behind the scenes talking about these things as friends, and me encouraging my process theologian buddy, hey, we probably should do some more political theory for the folks. And he kept saying things to me like, yes, but doesn't Whitehead just answer all these questions?
Oh, God.
To which I clearly said, no, he doesn't even ask them. And so as a result, this group of distinguished scholars who Tripp did smuggle some process thinkers in, I will say. So there's going to be everything from Kevin Carnahan talking about Christian citizenship in the Augustinian tradition to Robert Talese thinking about questions of agonistic democracy and the tensions that animate democratic life, to my buddy David Scott, who's actually one of, I think, the most interesting young thinkers in the game, wrestling with how does religion in the public square play out as a matter of philosophy of law. So really across the table, questions about the church, questions about religious reasoning, So we really do hope that you will join us for this, because at least from where I stand, the thing that we will probably talk about some today, the questions we bring to the table, I am really, really struggling with what's the fate of deliberative discourse when it turns out that deliberation seems to have no bearing on anything anymore, right? And so I think that all of us thinking together in this online space, but in public ways, is really, really needed.
Yeah. I agree. That's why I thought it was a good idea to do this. But, thinking about going into this, both the summit and then a series of conversations after it, I thought a way of kind of introducing all that's going to happen would be for us to take turns naming questions we have going in. And not that we have to unpack them, or obviously we aren't going to have answers yet, but oftentimes just the process of talking out, framing questions will both give an idea of what all the different voices are going to be contributing, but also we'll be able to have a little more clarity on what we're even listening for, and as we end up processing it. And then also during the week of the end of the month, we're going to do a series of live streams together with friends from the summit, engaging a lot of the questions and such that are rolling in early on before the follow-up longer interviews. So yeah,
I mean, and it's cool. So Martin Heidegger has this really cool model of how we read, and he says there's ultimately two options. We can go counter to a text, right, which is the way most of us are taught to read in intro to philosophy classes. Here's how you critique things, here's how you engage, here's where you show the problems with it. Or he says we can go to the texts or thinkers encounter. And so he suggests that latter model, right, going to the thinkers encounter, allows us to understand what questions motivated them to then write the text that they thought might answer it. And so in some ways, that's what we're trying to do today is, well, what are the encounters that we as thinkers, as humans, as people living in American democracy for what it's worth right now, how is it that we are encountering this set of issues so that we can, as Heidegger also says, catch up to where we already are, right? So none of us start from zero. We always are already moving in some direction. We've already got assumptions in play, and trying to get clear about, well, what are those assumptions? What are these things that we're bringing to the table in order then to begin reading together? That I think is a really, really important practice. And it's something I do with my classes and something I'm honored to do with you today, Tripp.
Awesome. So what's your first question? We can just take turns and see where this goes.
So I've kind of already announced it, but my biggest question, the one that is motivating me in my writing, those of you who don't know, I write for a Substack called Philosophy in the Wild. Come check it out. But what's happening in my writing, in my thinking, in my speaking, in my teaching across the board is, how can I continue to live like reason giving matters when it just seems like it doesn't, right? It no longer seems like the people that I encounter, whether I agree with them or disagree with them, the ones with whom I agree tend to take themselves up as clearly everybody else are fools. We're the only ones that understand how things should be. But then that also shuts down listening to objections and criticisms. And we end up engaging in what Rob Talese calls a kind of belief polarization, where we overestimate the evidence for our own views because we're not engaging people who think that those views are screwed up, right? And then on the opposite side, people with whom I disagree, like, yeah, I'm tempted by thinking that right now in our contemporary situation in the church and in society, man, like, we're disagreeing because they just are okay with injustice and okay with marginalization and okay with dehumanization and okay with irrationality. And I don't know how to talk to those people. So it's both directions. What do we do when reason giving fails? And that is, for me, a very, very pressing question for which I do not have a ready answer.
Yeah, that's helpful, because the I think part of this, and I have a question that's going in that's related to this, is what's the medium for democratic deliberation today? and how many of the kind of inherited mediums and assumptions have changed. Some of them have changed for good reasons, right? Like part of a democratic ideal is that all the stakeholders have a voice. More people have a voice than before. Net good, right? Like that happens. Also, that that you don't just have a voice, but you have people that choose to use their ears, right, and listen. And that task is becoming increasingly hard, not just because more people have voices. That's one feature. Be it like all of a sudden women could vote. Just think of that. But the voices also come from people with less and less shared narrative, assumptions about values and what the good life looks like, and that kind of thing. So then, what, do we have a medium where you can both speak and listen? And the net good of that exchange is the experiment worth becoming uncomfortable for, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, like, what is the medium of exchange? Or different elements to it, but it's increasingly problematized, and you can see people thinking it's no longer possible when any individual or a constituency chooses their own agenda over the preservation of the mediating principles, institutions, and such. And you just see that in the assumptions for it grow enough that, I'm sitting there going, well, I mean, if this is how we're doing things and AOC's president, why don't we just nationalize the space program? And social media platforms, right? Like, if this is what we're doing, right? And how that would be received on the other side. So like, to me, there's this question of the tension in democracy and that relationship of religion and politics is bundled up in whether or not there are virtues beyond our tribes worth becoming vulnerable to.
Yeah. So I think you're hitting on two related points, right? Which is, this medium traditionally has been a face-to-face discourse that, I mean, by traditionally, I'm thinking, over the majority of the years of this 200 plus experiment called America, we have thought about things in face-to-face contexts where we would wrestle with each other about ideas. And this happened in exceptionally local ways, right? The people with whom you would, the whole idea of a water cooler talk goes back to the idea that also, like, you would, hitch your horses outside of the saloon by the water trough. Like, this idea of local engagement around issues of local concern eventually got bigger and bigger and bigger. And this famously took on a vastly new form when we inaugurated the technology of radio. Then when it moved to television, of course, in the famous Nixon-Kennedy debates, right? Suddenly, it wasn't just ideas. It wasn't just engaging with your fellow citizens and your neighbors about how to do shared life together, as Bonhoeffer would say. Instead, it became, well, what do we imagine as the kind of vision that we want in leaders? And now it wasn't just ideas and, intelligence. It wasn't oratory skill. It was also, do they, as Trump is famous for saying, look good on television, right? But even then, we all watched 3 networks. Like, everything was still centralized in a way where the conversations at the water coolers the next day were anchored in some shared, as you put it, cultural assumptions, or at least a shared phenomenological experience, right? Now, the press coverage is already tailored to motivate certain affective responses from the people they think are most likely to be watching. So now you get different news streams to different people, fostered by algorithms that are already designed to make you emotionally upset. The biggest responses, right, are fear and anger. So if we can make people angry or scared, they will keep watching and they will want more of what we produce. So we now find ourselves where the very technology of access that drew more people in, created more avenues of participation, is also what is creating a rampant you might say, obstacle to engaging each other. And my buddy, in fact, I will plug it real quick. My buddy Mike Overitskell is just now finishing a book called Human is the New Vinyl, thinking about kind of what was lost when we moved from these creative beings thinking with each other as artists and musicians and actors and whatever, to a space where now, like, to be human created is almost like retro. And so when conversation, reason giving, deliberative engagement is retro, we clearly are in a space where the medium of discourse is not what it once was, right?
Yeah. And to me, one of the questions when you think about this and try to pause it, how do we address it? Depends on how the particular thinker how they identify the actual engine of change, right? So one of the like the difference between like Marx and Hegel, or is it ideas or material reality? Or if you think about this one, right? Like, is Marshall McLuhan helpful, right? Like that the medium is the message. So there's this shift of how communication takes place, and communication. I think this is one of Habermas's points, is that like political communication there, it entails both political agency, state function, and economic coordination, and how those three coordinate and get to any kind of generative equilibrium is what that equilibrium look like is completely changed based on the medium of communication. This is the way he starts thinking about how this shifts. And he was obsessed with the emergence of mass media, and now we got the kind of social or algorithmic media. And so I wonder what we learn, or what you think we learn by just noticing that shift from kind of print as the place we have access, information access. That's where in print, if you have access to information there, you express your preferences in print, and then you coordinate collective action in print. Like when print is the medium for that, it obviously had it was dominated by elite discourse. And it was that first move beyond just directly face to face. But it almost always supplemented a space that was face to face, be it,
and it does two things though, right? Because on the one hand, print requires structures. This is the economic dimension Habermas talks about, structures of literacy. And those traditionally were reserved for particular classes of society with particular access to these institutional powers, by which literate engagement made you then capable of moving forward, capable of opportunity, and capable of having your voice count, right? But notice also there's an old Platonic, Socratic question here, which is Socrates famously did not write anything. And part of why he didn't, he claimed, was the verbal utterances, like you and I talking to each other in real time in this live stream, allows us to then have our views transformed by the objections offered by my interlocutor, by my conversation partner. And Socrates thinks this is really, really profoundly important for somebody who loves truth, right? The problem with
act
print
of writing it down now makes you more attached to who Aaron was before he listened and was challenged and thought,
I might now think it's wrong, but that's the thing that you would take up.
You can admit that prehension is the philosophical idea that helps make sense of all sorts of things. It's okay.
Rather than making that make sense in terms of Derrida, which would be a hard task, the idea, right, is when you write something down, notice how this works for us. We then typically go on some sort of tour, whether that be with our friends or on an actual book tour or media tour, defending the view that we have put in print, leading people back to those stabilized views. But more than just we are now doubling committed to that view, it's, let's say that people find that written word. My goodness, like I wrote stuff 20 years ago, I really would disagree with today. But yet people find that and they think, Simmons thinks that X, right? And I'm like, well,
I'm a Simmons,
not really. It's strange. And so the idea that then we don't allow our ideas, our commitments, and our discourse to change is why Plato and Socrates have this debate about should we even write stuff down. I mean, but the founders of the American model of governance suggested we should have perpetual revolutions for the exact same reason, that what we think works right now may not in 10 years. And so Jefferson and Paine and others all suggested, hey, the Constitution is a guide for where we stand right now. It's got to be something that we keep reinventing, because that's what allows us to adapt to the objections and the better evidence that we encounter. So in some senses, the very idea that we aren't committed to this constancy of transformation is itself a failure of a kind of democratic impulse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it that even that shift from spoken to print, and then from print, which had, I mean, when you write, that's a very deliberative form, which then one side effect is you get attached to what you've already generated. But who gets to print and who's published has gatekeeping activities and such related to it. And the other element of it, print was the medium by which we moved into nation states, and you consolidated nation state identities. Yes, for like the economic and political side, but almost all nation states, and this is something you notice when you go to capitals of any nation. Yeah, there are statues for some political leaders, but there's usually statues for artists, right? So if you're in Edinburgh, Burns is sitting there, and there's a whole Burns supper every year, and he gave the Scottish people an identity through poetry and such. When we were in Prague, the same thing is true. Just on our recent trip, if you go to the University of Berlin and look at who they feature, a lot of Nobel Prize winners, these great philosophers, and then there are these poets, and those poets are the ones you're least likely to know if you're not a German. But if you're German, they know anyway. So like, to me, there's this sense, that print had this way of expanding the community that has a shared narrative. And it's
for us, that is,
you'll see it.
Well, yeah. I mean, for us, at least as for those within the American tradition, it's thinkers like, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, Dorothy Parker, these sorts of moves. I get Jane Addams' writings on the Whole House, like the way that we think about who we are as a people. When you go read W.E.B. Du Bois, right? It's changing how we make sense of who the we is when we talk about we the people. Well, Du Bois and Addams have a little different take. When you read Whitman, my goodness, he's as maximally inclusive as you could possibly be. The problem is he's also able to be maximally inclusive because he was wealthy enough in his space to be able to travel around and do the things he was doing, right? So it's not unimportant to think about the institutional and social structures that accord with the social norms by which what we take for granted as just normal engagement looks like. And part of, I think, what I wrestle with coming to what are the tensions of democracy is the very things that make democracy more inclusive, more accessible, more engaging, seem to, over time, be the very things that also make it less and less and less rigorous in its engagement itself. Yeah. Like I told some students the day of the election in November, I was like, one of the things that just constantly humbles me and makes me such a fan of democracy as an ideal is the fact that, the facilities worker down the hall that I pass going into my fancy Ivy Tower, classroom, we are equal when it comes to the voice that we bring to the voting booth. And there's something profound about that. I mean, we could talk about the theology of equality that shows up, right? However, it's also the case that when we start recognizing the very moral beauty of that equality, it also leads to a discursive problem, which is when there are so many voices, it becomes also very difficult to know which are the voices worthy of more attention, right? And so traditionally, that filter was you might say, unjustly, narrowed in particular ways, attending to certain histories and identities. But it also made for particular guidelines and social structures to be more accepted. And now we've had, in some senses, the erasure of those structures. So as what I would describe as a left populist, which is kind of, I think, where I come down, I'm a fan of this maximal inclusion, radical hospitality as a political good, also a moral requirement. And yet the sheer logistical problems that presents cannot be ignored. And so that tension is one that I think we've got to at least own, rather than, especially those of us on the left, acting like, oh, it's always better just to have more voices. Like, try that like in a youth camp. Eventually somebody's got to stand up and say, all right, y'all calm down for a second. Here's how we're going to get out of the auditorium. Right. And so that tension, how do you do that though, without falling back into the unjust structures of power? Who gets the microphone? I have ideas about maybe how I think that should go, but those are questions that are real questions for me going into this summit.
Yeah. And part of that microphone question changes, right? So there's that move from print to mass media, where the introduction of kind of the visual presentation and the role of the emotive and such, but it also generates the audience being passive in a different way than if you're actively reading or listening. Because you just have it on in the background and this kind of thing. But that move from there into a social media type thing it intensifies in a different way. So if you're thinking about voices, it expands the number of voices, but then everyone has this kind of information overload. There's not like a quality control mechanism. There's an algorithmically curated mechanism which values the kind of polarizing echo chamber, affective reinforcement, and all this kind of stuff. So then it leverages what would the kind of network effects in ways that may not be the most healthy for us, and it leads to a kind of collapse culturally in this time of all these different intermediating institutions, religion being one of them. So that you have a kind of real-time political engagement, but where the deliberative time is chucked for performative entanglements. And I think that there's a growing awareness that we aren't sure that our current platform managers may not have the good of the populace at heart in the way they structure it.
The amount of emphasis I want to put on that may not is hard to do.
These are questions, Aaron. We're settling them as we go through this.
Well, and it's interesting. So what you're leading us up to, Brandon and Josh both have kind of pointed out in the comments, which is when you bring religion in, I tend to think about this as a theological authoritative overlay, right? So certain views, certain perspectives, certain commitments end up now getting, as they put it, baptized by particular authority structures. And those authority structures, ironically, claim to be empowering the people, their audiences, their congregations, right, with wisdom, truth, goodness, beauty, discernment, etc. But often what tends to happen, and I think this occurs in all directions, is that theological authorities often, though not always, can present themselves as unchallengeable in principle. And therefore, the practice of theologizing, adding a theological overlay to political commitments, creates now the stakes of disagreement are unmanageable. So it's not just, hypothetically, you and I disagree about, monetary policy, say. It's now, well, if you disagree with me, Tripp, you're out of step with God's truth. You're out of step with what this authority structure that is ordained by the divine has reinforced and advocated. And that becomes, I think, one of the most difficult wrinkles to this loss of public reason giving is so many people take themselves to be engaging in good faith because they think the view they hold is not just justified, but required by the faith they've been taught. And that is a difficult place to move from. I mean, my goodness, imagine talking to a Swiftie and trying to explain this is not good music. Now, let's bracket whether or not it is.
I value my time.
Right. Like the sheer idea that whether or not it's amazing music or awful, the sheer idea that you could challenge that view is so unlikely because it's not simply a belief that is held. It's a core identity marker of how they take themselves up. And so when it comes to politics, Rob Talese does a lot of this work, who is one of our keynotes for this summit. He says there's really good data to show right now political division is becoming more important for identity than religious division. But part of why I would suggest is because the religious undertones or theological overlays are already supporting and then motivating why those political differences have such deep stakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I'm not even sure which one of us asked the last question, but
I think I did. So it's your turn.
Okay. Here's one that and I didn't even ask it till I'd seen a few different of the talks in that everyone's going to get to see because they seem like they came up with different answers to this. But what is he like? How in the world are Christians smitten with the least Christian president we've ever had? This is and it's not like if you just like made a list of ethical things and started checking them off. It's just that he's the first president that does not even need to gesture toward a Christian humanitarian ideal, right? Like he valorizes coercive power that is completely self-legitimating. He demonizes the other, like on July 4th, going after a whole half the country, and then narrates all relations with others in some zero-sum way where he is the valuator of what is good, true, and beautiful. There's no residue of an uneasy conscience, right? Like if you even think of like the politicians who I would say they should go to purgatory if I believed in it, which is, I think, kind of a requirement if you're going to be a president of the United States of America. But he's the only one that would never have lost sleep, right? You know what I mean? Like even George W. Bush lost sleep, and he's a war criminal. I'm saying that, not Aaron Simmons. Just so like he has no residue of an uneasy conscience, and he divides people by their allegiance to him, and defines his vocation as service. And not by, he defines his vocation as service to his bottom line, not to all people. So like all the gifts that Christianity gave Western civilization consciousness that are good. It's humanism, it's universalism, it's valuation of the weak as the locus of ethics. He doesn't have any of them. Like they don't exist in his mind at all. And
well, David Brooks puts this, and I wrote about this on Substack actually, but David Brooks puts this as it's a teenage version of Nietzsche that has now just been like run as not just political power, but actually somehow a distorted view of what Christian ethics involves. And for anybody who's watching, though friends of mine like Bruce Benson and I and many others draw lots from Nietzsche to think well about religious existence, none of us would suggest that Nietzschean ethics is a guide for living the way of Christ. So like this is as anathema as you could possibly get. And you're right to say somehow 81, give or take, % of at least white American evangelicals think that he is not just appointed by God, but a arm of the divine vision of social life. And I struggle with that as well. I wish Kevin Carnahan were here, because he and I have different views on why we think this is happening. For what it's worth, spoiler alert, his views are much more nihilistic and snarky than mine are.
No way.
So can you imagine?
It matches y'all's sense of humor. Is that?
So I'm with you. This is a great question. I think that there will be lots of different answers to this question, depending on the evidential base one wants to appeal to, right? So if it's a matter of, well, here's this historical progression, here's how we can track the rise of the moral majority, how things transformed under the Warren Court, the response to Jimmy Carter, like there's a historical story that can be told. There's another story, though, that's sociological, that we could tell about the way in which certain kinds of populist rhetoric has long been anchored in an American psyche. And this is something that originally was very much used by the left relative to unionization efforts and such, has now been deployed by the right to rally a certain kind of resistance to the very structures of educational identity that we used to prize as giving us the skills that we need, right? So, and I would say there's a theological story, right, that one could tell. That, I mean, my goodness, like William Barber tells a very interesting story about, and here I use these words in guarded ways in a kind of Barber space, but, there are demonic forces that function as power structures reinforcing their own narrative and status, right? Which is kind of Barber's way of reading liberation theology in this sort of, battle warfare royale. We could tell that story. As a philosopher, I can simply say, well, look, there's always been, from Foucault all the way back to Machiavelli and Hobbes and others, a deep, deep attraction to the powerful as the way that we can kind of see ourselves in someone else. And we don't like being duped, and we don't like being weak. And so when you've got a guy who steps up and says, I've never made a mistake, I've never made an error, I've never believed anything falsely, I've never missed a question on the GRE, like the sheer perversity of his arrogance is something that there's a deep philosophical account for why we find that more compelling than the stories of Mother Teresa wrestling with her own faith in the midst of genuine dark nights of the soul, right? We don't like that kind of ambiguity. And we've now got, you might say, economic reasons that continue to support, hey, how do you reinforce the erasure of your own mid-age misery? Make sure your kids think that there is only one way to grow up, and that is to care about the things that you have taught them are the only things to care about: money, wealth, status, success, power, right? And we end up in what my buddy Aaron James calls an asshole culture. But an asshole culture is what the philosopher Michel Henry describes as committed to a fake objectivity that leads to barbarism, because it erases all the creative upsurge that is anchored in being critically aware, humbly disposed, and then hospitably engaged with others. Trump is none of those things. So I can say philosophically, he's leading us into barbarism. And that barbarism is reinforced by a bunch of assholes who continue to present themselves as the ideal of human flourishing. So on all those levels, right, it's not that anyone's disagreeing with, yeah, we're screwed. Somehow the people who should be claiming X are out there rampantly defending not X. It's, well, how did we get here? There are lots of different stories depending on kind of what evidence you want to draw on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
is that hopeful enough? Are
yeah,
we
really
good to go?
All right, Aaron, what's your next question here?
So I am wrestling. I'll make this one really, really practical. So, should we? And I think I know the answer to this as I ask the question, but I'm going to ask it because it depends on the day whether I think the answer works. Should we engage in regular economic and social interaction with people who represent the worst behaviors and the worst commitments of our social lives? Here's an example. There is a barbecue shop near where I live. I will not mention the name of the barbecue shop. I love their barbecue chicken. It's quite fantastic. They have an amazing hot barbecue sauce that is just absolutely glorious. Unfortunately, when you walk into that barbecue shop, there are not one, not two, but multiple MAGA statements and flags and all kinds of signs that are not just, oh, they are conservative and support Trump, but like start reflecting some of the worst views within the Trumpist world. So do I go get barbecue there? And I think the answer is yes, because you engage with those with whom you disagree. Like I want that to be the answer. The problem is I think, well, how else could we possibly engage in social critique when there's no space of actual engagement? Right? We're not watching the same TV shows. We're not going to the same things. We're not, if we aren't actually in our local spaces saying, you know what, respect you as a person. I would love to get coffee and hear about why you hold the views you do and think with each other, but I can't eat your barbecue because I cannot support the structure of people who are supporting this injustice. So there's a very practical and petty, like I feel icky even saying that I wrestle with that question, but it genuinely is one with which I wrestle. What about you? Is that a thing that you have encountered? I mean, you're in the South.
I thought about that a lot more before I got assigned the psychological science and religion class and realized like the actual way someone changes their mind is through social fusion, which is either first or second hand relationships with people in non-partisan spaces, right? Like meaning like you're not in any conflict with anything. So you have social or economic relations or anything like that. You're involved in the same social group, you coach together, go through the list. Any of those type of relations have more power at changing one's mind on an issue or expanding the legitimate space in the public square, right? So they might not go, I'm a left-wing populist like Aaron since he ate my barbecue. But they're, it's much more likely to be like, well, at least he's not that bad. And this has been shown on in multiple different Western countries, as well as both political and religious issues or cultural ethical issues. So like even let's say someone that's a Bible believing evangelical Christian, explaining to them that the clobber verses in the Bible for LGBTQ exclusion are kind of like stupid and make no sense if you understand the Bible. It just doesn't mean what they think it means. That is less compelling as just one of their best friends has a gay kid.
Yep.
And so, and you could go, oh, well, then I guess truth doesn't matter, blah, blah, blah. Or you go, the truth of material existence is the image of God that is expressed in the multiplicity of human beings in their lives. And that is ultimately more compelling because the face of that other that they would want to other is the actual invitation to meet Christ, if you're a Christian, God, the sacred, whatever, that their face calls them to account, right? And so when we create those barriers and kind of like self sort more and more, then you actually create the context where what is it in those different tribes that legitimate dismissing of the other get stronger. And that's something I know Robert talks about in his book, and y'all talked about in the interview you did with him a few weeks ago, that like once part of your self-definition is purity, it just keeps getting more pure, right? And so so then you change your mind to go along with what everyone in your group is. You start kicking out people that are 90% on your team, this kind of thing. it could lead you to go like, oh, this is the most votes any Democrat running for mayor has ever had, and yet you disagree on something and you aren't sure you're even going to support your own party. Like you do something like that because they aren't
the purity tests are complicated.
Yeah. Anyway,
so what do you think though? Because like what Talese argues, and I think he's got to be right about this, but it's knowing he's right is different than enacting the rightness. He says the way that we overcome belief polarization, which is the idea that people with whom I agree, my team, as you just described, starts getting so pure that then it kicks out the posers, but the posers are everybody on their own team that's just not as extreme as they are, right? And so we keep moving further and further and further toward this purity model that makes things worse and worse and worse because now we are more risky in our behavior, more antagonistic in our engagement, and we've gutted any chance for a correction within our own community, right? Any objection from within is canceled as being one of the others. So he says the only way that we can get out of this, I mean, and this is a guy, he was a professor of mine at Vanderbilt. We're very good friends now. This is a guy who is rational all the way down.
He wrote the Guide to Pragmatism. Like
he is not somebody who is wedded to emotional responses very easily. It's like, how do we move forward? What are the arguments for it? And his answer is a kind of sociological response, like you're saying. We go bowling with people, back to the bowling alone phenomenon, right? We go join book discussion groups, but we're talking about fiction. We take, video game conferences. We hang out with each other because we're fans of craft beer or coffee or something. So his suggestion is you don't stop eating at the barbecue place. You actually now start talking more frequently with the people who work at the barbecue place so that they start seeing you as a member of their community. And so then when there might, who knows, be chances of any sort of disagreement, it's occurring within but wait a minute, you can't hold that view because you're a human. And only, Galrogs or whatever hold that view. That can't be right. And so I think there's got to be something about real embodied human engagement that matters. And my goodness, even during World War II, Richard Rorty talks a lot about this, where he says it wasn't ultimately arguments or appeals to grand themes. It was the fact that you had kids that played on the same soccer team that caused you to think it wasn't okay that your neighbors were getting killed in the Holocaust, right? Now, there's been some objections. Norman Garros and others have said, well, now, wait a minute. But when asked, those people said, I recognized in my neighbor humanity, which is something thicker, something deeper, right? Maybe theological, philosophical, or whatever. So it's not that we abandon ideas, but those ideas play out as on the ground, interactive stuff. I mean, you and I, when we go watch Wake Forest and Florida State football games, where Florida State hopefully will continue to destroy Wake Forest at all fronts. When that occurs,
you'll at least spend the most money, Aaron.
But when we go see this, like, we end up, just because we're the kind of people we are, talking theology and philosophy in the stands. But our discourse is now anchored in embodied human togetherness in a way that makes the stakes of those disagreements or those tensions maybe less severe, right? So that's where I ask this question. Should we eat the barbecue place? Should you get your oil changed at the, guy who's got the Trump flag out front? I want to say, of course you do, but then you also try to establish relationships in those spaces. But I'll be honest with you. I told my wife this week, she said, you want to go get barbecue? It's like, kind of don't want to support them right now. Right? So this is the tension in my own life. So what about you? Back to you. A question you're wrestling with.
Here, even on that question, I can think of like 4 or 5 different variables different people in the summit will name. Right. So even if you have this question, there are different ones, and obviously multiple ones could be part of an explanation. But right. So part of it is the question underneath this is material anxiety. So the same social psych stuff that we'll talk about, personal conflict, personal connection, overcoming these kind of like judgments. Also recognize the likelihood of one seeing difference as anxiety inducing, generating kind of like power to the otherness, is intimately connected to the horizon of possibilities for them, their kids, and grandkids. And so like one of the things, and this is something I wanted to ask Robert about, like, yes, I like the kind of finding adjacent space connections is one variable, but another is if people weren't worried about healthcare and retirement, or in housing costs, or there are all these material variables that we know psychologically make one more prone towards authoritarian turns, towards violent rhetoric, and all the kinds of things that generate the toxicity at the level of culture. And this isn't just on the right. This is how human beings respond. So
it's Rene Girard's scapegoating, right? I mean, this is just the way mimetic desire is going to function in a social space.
And so the adjacent space thing he raises, I think, is important, and so is the material one. There's also the problem of cultural coding that runs through it. So when anxiety is ratcheted up and tribalism is up, then those adjacent spaces, and this is something I think you are voicing, like even in your conversation with Vanessa about going to the barbecue place, is but it is culturally coded, right? So if we go to this restaurant, it means X about me, right? And
that's right.
Or if I get my wedding cake from here, or I sell a wedding cake to these individuals, it means X, Y, and Z, right? So the even the number of adjacent spaces, what are the real ones where they're actually kind of like, free space for cultural interaction, and which ones actually involve somebody crossing cultural code lines on behalf of something bigger, right? And so and what those look like really vary as to who you are. So you and I, straight white guys, crossing it into that barbecue restaurant's one thing, but we have friends
that's right.
It's a very different element. And the other variable that it was going to Europe and just talking to lots of people that made it stick more is social cohesion. There, immigration is a very different topic than it is here, in the sense of it's not from Central and South America primarily, but it's Muslim immigrants into Europe, right? So more like 70% of the kids being born in London, parents are not from the UK, right? So this, I heard this from waiters across Europe in all the different countries, and it doesn't sound the same there, but I guess I listened better because it didn't sound like racist rednecks. but that also connects to another feature of the social psych stuff that Robert didn't talk about in the book. Well, I read them quickly and sent you questions, but I don't remember him talking about, is it that they from best that we can tell, there is a percentage of influx of a different culture that unsettles social cohesion, right? And so oftentimes we frame the immigration discussion in the West as those that are like kind of like cosmopolitans. So we want better menus and better food from around the world, and we should be welcoming and opening to everyone and this kind of thing. And then the other side, we're like, oh, they're being racist, or they're being closed-minded, or whatever. And they have this, they have a kind of like cultural essentialism that there is an identity, there is something to being American, or something to being British, or something to being German, or something. Anyway, I heard it in all the Europe. I went to 4 different countries, even in like even in Switzerland, I heard it repeatedly. So, wow. And what was interesting in Europe is, well, how does this create problems, right? So they are all apologizing to me for having Trump as president. So they'll share their problems to make me feel better. But it almost all was, they see the social safety net, the things of if you have a shared story as a nation, access to them, getting access to them is the biggest threat. And then, well, they don't, and it's not even moral things. It doesn't sound like they're gonna instill Sharia law, or they don't say that kind of stuff. It's like, well, we had to put up I don't want to hear the call to prayer in the middle of my worship service, or I don't want to hear, and you can get how you're sitting there with someone whose family's been there 600 years and going, I don't recognize my neighborhood anymore. Is that even a viable opinion to have in a democracy? Right. And I think that but like once we ask that social cohesion question, there are all these variables that show up at the macro to like the material, and it's just so complicated, and which ones drive more of the others, but almost all of them have like psychological science that goes, this makes us worse, and it's hard to then talk about them politically. Like if Trump and JD Vance had done what they said they were doing on economic policy when they were running, not like the opposite in the big beautiful bill, like there would be less tension if the like family income tax credit was expanded, and and the decrease of child poverty that was accomplished under Biden's administration didn't get unfunded but was refunded and expanded, which is what they said they were going to do. It didn't happen. But the conflict, like what happens in that, undoes a lot of the toxicity that generates this tension, or like us never having an immigration policy generates for now cultural ideals of the cultural essentialist or the cosmopolitan are like lambasting the other, even though the potential for a cosmopolitan view or preservation of any historic ties to the past are undermined by making no decisions and letting the market decide. So the kind of political impotence around these different variables, they mostly make me depressed.
Well, so I think the way I think about that in ways that make as you put it, the kind of racism, the xenophobia, the sexism, homophobia, all these things that one would rightly morally oppose, it makes those sort of bracketed just enough to see the political theoretical question that's being asked, right? And the way I think about it is this. Think about your favorite band, and you go, or even genre, and you're going to concerts of that genre or by that band. And then suddenly a whole new group of fans start showing up, but they do not understand the mode by which this space has traditionally operated. And maybe even their presence is now creating a new kind of intolerance, moral repugnant views maybe start showing up internal to this space, right? It doesn't seem unreasonable that you would be radically hostile to these transformations in your cultural imagination, in these social constructions that are pre-existing the contemporary space, right? And just as a couple examples, like if I'm editing this book right now, co-editing this book called The Heaviest Ideas in the Universe, and it's a philosophy of heavy metal. Super stoked about it. Hopefully it'll be out in the spring. And it's a hardcore academic book, and there's all these academics taking really serious considerations of heavy metal culture, lyrics, performance, etc. Well, one of the guys named Nick Smith, I actually did an interview with him on my podcast called God Hates Us All Radio, which is about philosophy, heavy metal, and theology and stuff. Nick argues that there are norms that operate in a pit, right? This organic, pulsing, dangerous thing that happens at extreme metal shows. And he says the only way to understand a pit is to understand that there is a lot of moral repugnance involved, right? People are getting hurt. There's all kinds of horrifying toxic masculinity that plays out in these spaces. It's a very elitist space. It often ends up having kind of racist overtones. Like, this is a horrifying warrior ethos thing that we should get away from. However, it's also a space of radical equality, human engagement, everybody's welcome. You understand if somebody goes down, you stop and you pick them up. Like, there are rules that govern this space. And so somehow it's both of these sides that form this thing. But when it gets taken over by folks who don't understand how these rules work, it just becomes dangerous. It flips into its worst temptations rather than those temptations being things to avoid, right? And so this philosopher, Nick Smith, like, wrestles with these tensions, and he describes the need for what he calls pit elders, which is one of my favorite new cultural terms. So a pit elder is somebody who's been there, done that. Now maybe he's not in the middle of stuff, but is the person kind of there making sure that they're kind of, hey, you want to join this thing, young buck? Come on. There's ways this works, right? The problem is that sounds a lot like what we would call, gatekeeping and policing borders and excluding difference and not allowing for marginal voices to have a space. Like, so the very thing that in those spaces I would suggest is necessary to prevent it going off the rails is, and actually makes it accessible then to new people who are coming into that community. Those are the very things that in other spaces we, especially on the left, would see as the very worst manifestations of the moral failures we oppose, right? So unless, again, maybe this is kind of what my moral overlay on all of these questions, unless we are open to being radically interrogated by the questions like these, we likely will take ourselves to be the smug ones who have it all figured out, and then won't recognize these pressure points in our own behavior, right? And so I think I love that you went to Europe to discover these issues, because it sometimes requires being in a space where it feels different enough to see what is otherwise taken for granted, right? So if I've not been to a Taylor Swift concert, and I don't mean to keep picking on her, but if I go to a Swift concert, there's a whole bunch of norms operative there that I just don't get. However, if I
to bring bracelets though,
a lot of glow sticks apparently, but if those Swifties come hang out with me at a Lorna Shore, concert, or by the way, I know Josh Patterson's watching. I'm hoping to go see Signs of the Swarm and Dying Fetus this fall. Like, these are not bands where the Swiftie assumptions are going to operate easily, right? But does that mean that they shouldn't operate? Well, maybe, right? It's like understanding multiculturalism is a good. Multiculturalism also comes at costs of social cohesion that might be necessary for a certain kind of deliberative democratic project. And that tension is an old tension. And it's a tension that goes all the way back to ancient philosophy, wrestling with what do we do with people who aren't part of this group that we are setting as our boundaries, right? So I think you're asking the right question on this, Tripp. And I don't have good answers for it, because I think when we put it in different contexts, we get it. But when we put it in our political context, it feels not only gross, but deeply and quickly immoral. So
I feel like there's a whole Substack post called America Mosh Pit America.
Well, I was going to use the example. Dead Kennedys has this very famous song called Nazi Punks F Off. And the whole point is they wrote it to basically say, hey, Nazis, skinheads, stop coming to our concerts. Like, you are antithetical to everything we stand for, right? And there's something important about saying, no, you don't get to play with us here unless you make these sorts of transformations. But again, you could see very quickly where then that runs afoul of Rob Talise's claim, who, by the way, is a big punk head from way back who's a fan of the Dead Kennedys, but unless we're somehow finding ways to be in the pit together, how are we going to change their views about stupid stuff, immoral stuff, like Nazism, right?
Did you know that Superman was really into punk music when he was an adolescent? It's in the new Superman movie.
Oh, okay.
And he's like listing off like 90s punk bands, and then he says the PODs, and I just started laughing, and I was like, they have an album called Snuff the Punk, but I don't remember ever classifying POD as punk.
No, I saw POD actually in concert for the first time last year, and for what it's worth, they were fantastic, absolutely just fire. But yes, I've listened to POD all the way back to their Brown album and stuff, and there's nothing in anything they've ever done that I would consider punk.
What about Live at Tom Fest? The French fry song is like, I want my French fries, I want my French fries, and it's like 90 seconds, but the drummer is doing a punk beat while he's yelling about wanting French fries.
Man, that's what a deep cut.
That's the closest I can get for a POD. The
closest you can get. Yeah.
I'm not going to argue with Superman.
You can't. I mean, that's fascinating. Yeah, I don't know.
I love classic rock, like Imagine Dragons.
So I am realizing that clearly from the comments that are now popping in, the audience is way more interested in us talking about those things than these deep questions of deliberative existence.
Well, that's because, look, Josh had me join his Emogelicals podcast and sent me Lorna Shore songs before the thing. And I was just like, what was this that just happened?
The pig squeals. I keep telling Josh that Lorna Shore, though I like them, deathcore in general, and these are fighting words, but deathcore in general is just rhythmically boring. And so as a professional drummer for a long time, I find blast beats technically impressive. I can't play very many of them just because it's a different skill set, but I find them boring. And so I am a much bigger fan of extreme metal that has more rhythm. So I wish I could convince Josh to move more into the Nails and Gojira space, than the Lorna Shore space. But that's okay.
Well, I don't even remember exactly what I said about them, but I remember being amused that I was on a podcast where I'm like, you have to actually read the lyrics to have any idea what the guy's singing. And
of course, now I just want to note for everyone listening, that may have been the oldest thing Tripp Fuller has ever said on a podcast.
Dude,
I gotta listen. I gotta look at these lyrics. I can't understand what he's saying.
Because they're like, we're going to talk about this music, and I hit play, and I'm like, what in the world?
You're probably annoyed at all the teenagers dropping off flyers to mow your lawn, aren't you, Tripp?
Yeah, I mow my own grass.
Oh goodness.
No, I came up with things to say, but I think repeatedly I was like, I really feel like Aaron would have done better in this episode. But if you want to talk about counting crows, then I'm game.
Oh my gosh. Well, I think yes, though I am tempted to dive into The Pain Remains 1, 2, and 3 into the Hellfire. I think a question that I have that I'll throw out there is, so when reasons fail, what comes next? That's a question I have. So we've already talked about kind of what do we, like this reason seems to be failing. What happens to discourse? But what comes next? So this is a question that, again, buddies like Kevin Carnahan and others who work in just war theory have very particular takes on. But like, at what point is some version of just war possible as a appropriate cultural response? And again, it makes me cringe to even say that. But I think that we are nearing, and again, I don't even mean just war in terms of violence, right? But just active, forceful resistance strategies.
Yeah.
Is that something that is required when reason giving fails? And there is a long just war tradition that suggests it might be. And so that's a question I'm wrestling with as well.
Ooh, that does sound fun. Okay, here's my last question, because I realize how long we've been talking. And so I recently read, because a couple friends were reading. I read it, I don't know, sometime in Scotland, Tom Holland's Dominion. But I was rereading it because they wanted to talk about it. And this is a large book where, a historian of Rome and Greece. He also wrote a book on the history of Islam. Tells the history of Christianity and its relationship in the West, and in it, he wants to point out how there are all these features of the larger Western culture that don't exist without the historical accident of Christendom. Humanism, universalism, the valuation of the weak, these kinds of things that Trump doesn't even posture towards, right? So
Gianni Vattimo makes similar sorts of claims.
Yeah, and so this is a a kind of like a history that is kind of like a genealogy of their birth, like from the cross. How does it become culturally normative and shape stuff? And then what happens with Christianity in the decline? And so I found the book fun, and then realized it got really popular like years after the book came out, and he's done lots of talks about it. So I watched a few talks, and he asked the question, like, what do you do as someone, he grew up Anglican, but he's not religious. He would have said he was agnostic or whatever, but but after doing this book, he's like, I don't know what the future of the West is without the kind of shared religious superstructure of Christianity. And he gave kind of three possibilities, each of which I could, if you were like, debate this, pick one, I could do all three, So one, he goes, what a lot of people were hoping for in Western elites is that Christianity is like a spaceship where it takes off, and then religion and Christianity are like the booster rockets. That once it's out of gravity, they fall off, and then you keep all the perks, and they exist there.
Which would be Derrida's religion without religion. We have the structure, no longer the determinate content. Yep.
Right. And at least in our current historic moment, that evidence seems to undermine that as a functioning, or at least as an accurate prediction of where we are in the present. The second option is like Christian belief in ethics. They recede, and as they do, as humanism and universalism, the value of the weak, and these kind of things decline, a new authoritarianism emerges as the binding narrative of protection and orientation for people, where you no longer have these shared assumptions that we posture towards.
And this, by the way, is Simon Critchley's book, Infinitely Demanding, which you and I talked about on a podcast a couple months ago, where he says, when you end up after the death of God, you have either active nihilism or passive nihilism. And the active nihilists are way more interesting because they become authoritarians.
Yeah.
Right? The passive nihilists just start podcasts and whine about things, he suggests. And so there's definitely going to be a kind of authoritarian upsurge, he says, because we've lost the authority structure by which we understand meaning as stable. And so we go desperately looking for something to replace it. And he says authoritarianism, especially right-wing populist authoritarianism, fills that gap because it positions itself as a God without God in ways that let the God people still use that rhetoric, which is another way of explaining why so many white evangelicals are still Trump fans.
Yeah. Or how the Nazi regime, which was anti-Christian, was surprised about the responsiveness of the German Christian church movement, and then decided to mute some of their internally explicit critiques of Christianity and said, hey, let's just wait until after we win the war to eliminate Christianity, right? Like
exactly.
But in the meantime, we can de-Jewify the Bible. Which they did anyway.
I think that understanding, for folks that like these different discursive options, these different strategies, there's reasons why there are like traditions predicting them, right? Because it's not, we're not facing something radically new. We're facing the almost necessary results of very old tendencies newly presented. And by the way, hello, Michael. Great to have you join us.
So you get the spaceship takeoff, right? The boosters leave of religion, but the trajectory goes. Oh, the belief recedes, the ethical reservoir, is undermined. And then he said there's also the possibility of some kind of return to the root of Western existence, which is largely, he would say something like Jerusalem and Rome and Athens filtered through the cross. And in that group has, of late been really interested in some of the kind of Gen Z responsiveness to more traditional Christianity, and that kind of thing. But it's fascinating. Like, you quickly were just naming philosophers I was thinking of. He's a historian giving these ideas, and I'm like, well, whose theory of religion would match this, right? And I think the temptation for more progressive Christians is the first, that our anthropology is not low enough, so we think it's like a spaceship. It was a gift to humanity, but it's still here. And now we're in orbit, and no longer the gravity of our biological based psychological mechanisms that were evolved over, hundreds of thousands of years. We've transcended them. And I think that's true for a generation or two, and then dies. Because everyone starts at ground one, and then what do? You receive the culture and the world you find yourself, and it's not one with a residue of belief or the of Christendom. It's one that all of a sudden the very same tribe that before was like, we can't have a guy lie about getting his D sucked, or like, we've tried to turn the other cheek guy. Let's try smacking him around, right? And it's like to me, like, I would think I would naturally, my intuition would be one, the first option. That's what I would think I would be hoping for. I would be fearing the idea that when the dissipation of belief, ethics dissipates, and I would just naturally be worried that a return to religion's return to the worst parts, right? So
but see, I think I land differently here. And by the way, Josh, the book is Infinitely Demanding by Simon Critchley. So I worry about the first, we'll call it your spaceship model, right? I worry about the spaceship model because, as John Sanders and I have argued elsewhere, when we start making religion and God and theology just kind of propadeutics to good liberal politics or something, what we've ended up doing is thrown the baby out with the bathwater in really, I think, problematic ways. And so we end up actually with a dangerous sense of we are like, notice the weird self-congratulatory rhetoric that happens. We are the only ones who recognize the stuff that we've got to abandon and the stuff that can remain. And the stuff that remains, well, who-de-do? It looks an awful lot like me and my pure tribe who've got it all figured out.
Yeah.
Right? So the worry about the benefits of the spaceship model are that it actually fosters even more belief polarization in the process. So I actually would probably land, like, politically, number one, hands down.
Yeah, that's what I was meaning. The assumptions of progressives act as if one is true.
Yes, right. And I'm entirely politically fine with number one. As a member of a multicultural, plural, radical democracy, I think at the end of the day, you got to say, you know what? Whatever your religious views, you got to bracket the way those reasons function for you when you come to debate in public spaces. And we've got to find ways to give reasons that are accessible to all members of our society. Full stop. That sounds very spaceshipy. But I also tend to think that philosophically, personally, existentially, it's got to be something like three. And the return to religion, the return of religion, and this was, of course, a very prominent discourse, right, in French philosophy over the last 50 years. The return doesn't have to be a return to the isolationism and xenophobia and authoritarian tendencies. It instead can be, and I think that some of the models here are going to be maybe ironic, it might be a return to religion where the death of God opens really important understandings of the stakes and risks involved in faith, right? This is some of my work on Kierkegaard, I think, emerges in that sort of space. It could be a return to religion whereby we understand, well, what is religion as its most basic? It's a deep, deep attempt to make sense of a world that too easily could seem meaningless. And those are going to be deeply human endeavors in that moment. And some of the religious, and scare quotes, moves that one might make there could be to a kind of faithful atheism, right? So I don't think that the return to religion has to now be a return to exclusivism, but I do think it can return to the determinacy of the content of the traditions in which we find ourselves. So I want to return to absolute hospitality modeled by the person of Christ without exclusivist soteriology that suggests the only way to participate in that hospitality is to actually not make it very absolute in the first place, right? It's pretty conditional. So I think if we're just better at the things we were doing, I do think there is a possibility of self-correcting, self-critical, deeply humble, hospitable moves. And I think religion's actually one of the great archives that has given us those impetus to begin with.
Yeah. All right. I think if I say anything, it'll just detour into a long discussion.
I think we need to come back to this question, though, for sure. Right?
Because here's the thing I find fascinating is, like, I think I would have said a whole lot of the things you were saying until I was a minister. Like, if I was just doing my PhD in philosophy, I would have said all that. And then the thing is, every human being is born at square one, and the seemingly existentialist radical theology option of all the fruit without the tree really only works for humanities degrees with people with 120 IQ or above. They don't self-reproduce, and they don't have children that believe enough to have anything. I know all these people, and I mean, if we just surveyed them about the form of life of their children, they would not volunteer as much or give as much as someone that went to a Bible-believing Baptist church. That's the material outcome. You volunteer more, you serve more, you give more, and all those kinds of things if you're actually in any historic wisdom community. And so, there's the intellectual way of getting there, but it's almost like, yes, that's always a live option, but it doesn't exist if you never grow legs. And also human beings are kind of in this, they are the cognitive mechanisms that human beings are born with are ones that are going to generate belief of some sort.
Well, and I'll say something controversial, given some of our friends and our shared and mutual audiences. I think I identify as a postmodern progressive Pentecostal, and yet I think
you're like half
progressive. What?
I said you're like half of it.
I was talking to a pastor friend of mine this week, and I told her that the Venn diagram where I stand, it turns out, is sadly two people. And it turns out that Jamie Smith is no longer a Pentecostal, and so it's really just me. Like, it is a very strange little space, right? But look, though I will say Jamie is an amazing BMX rider. If he would take up mountain biking, maybe he would return to the fold of the elect. And he thinks that if I would just learn to ride without brakes, I would actually live into the risk of faith. So, we land differently, right? But look, I think that progressives, so here I'm talking about a political category, progressives tend to be very, very confident about why critique would make them dumber. And I think that that's a robustly understandable and yet horrifyingly dangerous place to be. What I will call loosely postmodern Christians, which again, I'm trying to say I'm part of all these things I'm critiquing, right? Postmodern Christians often, though not always, have real deep traumatic experiences and stories of hurt within religious communities that have motivated transformation, and that's why sometimes they're landing in different spaces. But as we also know, right, people who have been hurt often, though not always, are the ones most likely to hurt others, because that becomes, again, a kind of mode in which they know how to operate. It's the social context. It's the pit that they've understood how to live in. And I think that sometimes we postmodern Christians can be some of the rhetorically most inclusive and yet internally exclusive and negative and nihilistic people that I hang out with. And so finding a way to say, well, what does it look like to genuinely love the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the marginal, the oppressed, the outcast, and then recognize, and sometimes those people are going to also be not the people who look like what our progressive sense needs them to look like, right? That tension is one that I think makes us ill-prepared for the kind of work that we have knighted ourselves as the only ones capable of addressing, right? And so that's not really a question. It's more of a concern about where we find ourselves. But I definitely am wrestling with that in my own life, in my own communities, because, man, it is just so easy to be smug. And I'm trying very hard to let my philosophical training challenge me anytime I start feeling like I'm getting that way. But then I try to also remember, no. My Christian upbringing should be the first thing I reach for to challenge this, because that's fundamentally part and parcel to the ethics of Christian existence.
Makes you want to ask that question. What would Jesus deconstruct?
What would Jesus deconstruct? And yeah, if only somebody had written that book.
I know. It was very catchy. I think we should trademark it right now. This has been a lot of fun, Aaron. Thank you all for joining. All of you that joined live. I just realized, like right at the end of this, that there's like 300 and some people watching on Substack, and apparently their comments don't come through, but all the other platforms do.
And I want to apologize to my Substack, because I tried to link this and make it live stream, and I actually don't know if it did.
I didn't know it did till someone texted me and said, "Did you see the questions?" And I'm like,
comments,
I see them coming up, and then I looked on Substack, and it is working, and there are hundreds of people on it, but the comments don't come through. So we'll see if we can figure that out.
Well, and I tried to link it to my Substack, Philosophy in the Wild, and unfortunately, it kept telling me, "Sorry, you can't do this." So I linked it to my YouTube channel. So I genuinely don't even know where it was being streamed on my platforms, and so I apologize to anybody who
can share it around.
Trying to find it.
We can share it around tomorrow. But yeah,
and everybody, come check out. Good.
See all of our friends tell us we're wrong.
Well, and come think with us, because we genuinely did not put these people together for the Democracy and Tension Summit because we think they've got the answers. We put it together because we think they ask these questions in constructive ways, and we need you all to think with us about how to think about these questions even more profoundly.
Yeah, and they're also the ones that said yes.
It turns out that's not a high bar.
Email your peers, and they're like, "Would you record a lecture? We'll share with a bunch of people, and then you come talk to us about answers. And can you do it in a few weeks?" And I'm not sure playing on the internet with Aaron and Tripp is a CV indent. And they say yes.
I should say, when I asked Rob Talese to do this, who's a really big name political philosopher, he sent me an email. He says, "So let me get this straight. You want me to just basically go to Zoom and record myself saying the stuff that I say all day long anyway?" Sure, that seems like an easy thing to do. So he got the the actual ask really well.
Yeah. But so anyone that said yes had both the time, freedom, and the passion and wanted to contribute. So excited to share them and excited to do this with you, Aaron. So everyone,
hey man, back at you.
Come all, go to homebrewedclasses.com and you can join up for the summit. And you can tell your friends. Say, look, you don't have to join at a specific time. You can watch the lectures that are most exciting to you whenever you want. And
something I think would be cool because of the way this is structured, where the questions can come in, behind the scenes. They'll incorporate them into these interviews in the future. I think it would be super, super, super cool for all of you watching now, hearing this later. Like, send the link, encourage friends of yours with whom you disagree, who you wish you could have these kinds of conversations with, or maybe you don't know how to have these conversations, because I think it would be wonderful for this Democracy Intention Summit not only to be peopled with people with whom we find ourselves already in agreement. I think that would be less productive. It would have less traction, and it would have less impact on, I think, the people that need to think with us. So send it to friends, colleagues, family who you think, my gosh, that guy is out of his mind. But hey, maybe you should think with us about democracy. I think that would be wonderful, and it will make all of us better.
All right. Well, we'll see you all soon.
Sounds fantastic.